Welcome to the Minds of Murderers podcast, episode 5. The podcast dedicated to bringing you regular, true crime content in an unbiased and factual manner. If you enjoy the podcast, please like us, rate us, and share us wherever you are watching, as it helps us immensely during these early stages. This episode will be focusing on H.H. Holmes, a prolific American serial killer active towards the end of the 19th century. If the devil ever did walk among us, it would have been in the guise of H.H. Holmes. Herman Webster Mudgett, who had later claimed the alias Henry Howard Holmes, was born on May 16, 1861. This man would evolve into one of America's first serial killers. The Mudgett family was a typical hard-working middle-class family. Parents Levi Horton Mudgett and his wife Theodate Page Price were children of first-generation English immigrants in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. They had 5 children: Ellen, Arthur, Herman, Henry, and baby Mary. Please note that from this point on, I will be referencing to Mudgett as Holmes, since that's what he is most commonly known as. As a child, Holmes claimed that his father was an extremely violent and abusive man. These claims could never be substantiated with any of his other children, so it is believed to be false or exaggerated. This pattern of lying and exaggeration would continue throughout his entire life, so some areas of his life, such as his childhood, are unclear. Holmes was a brilliant child and became fascinated with death and medicine after his classmates forced him to stand in front of a skeleton that was used in the doctor's office and stare at it. He said that this experience purged him of his fears about death and led to his obsessions. Later, he would start to trap and kill small animals so he could dissect them, performing a sort of rudimentary surgery on the creatures. At some point in his youth, he was suspected of killing a classmate, a little girl. It was never verified that he was involved in the death, but suspicion remained. He graduated high school at age 16 and took a teaching job in the nearby town of Alton. He would soon go on to marry Clara Lovering on July 4, 1878. They lived in London, New Hampshire and had one son, Robert Lovering Mudgett, on February 3, 1880. The little family moved to Burlington, Vermont, where Holmes began attending medical school at the University of Vermont. He was exceedingly displeased with the school and its curriculum and dropped out after only 1 year. He returned to his medical studies in 1882 at the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery. He enjoyed his experience here, but was a somewhat mediocre student. He worked in the anatomy lab under Professor Herman, the chief anatomy instructor. This helped him gain access to cadavers. He would take out life insurance policies with false information on the cadavers, then steal cadavers from the lab, disfigure and or burn them, and plant them somewhere they could be easily discovered. He would then collect his insurance payout. He graduated from medical school with his doctorate in 1884. By this point, his wife Clara had already left him, taking her son with her as she moved back to New Hampshire. She said Holmes was incredibly violent towards her. After Clara left, she no longer heard from Holmes, and he had no further contact with his ex-wife or son. Holmes moved briefly to Moores Fork, New York, where he was seen in the company of a young boy who would later go missing. Anyone who asked Holmes about the boy was told that he had been sent back to Massachusetts. There was no investigation into the boy's disappearance. Next, Holmes moved to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Here he got a job at a drugstore, but he didn't last long before suspicion fell on him for the death of a boy who died after being given medicine that Holmes had mixed together. He vehemently denied all accusations and fled the city. Before moving to Chicago, Illinois, he changed his name unofficially to Henry Howard Holmes. This would be the city where H.H. Holmes was truly born. He changed his name so that he wouldn't be connected to his previous crimes and scams. He wanted to start with a clean slate. Holmes started working for Dr. Henry H. Holton and his wife Elizabeth in August 1886. He was a good, hard worker. Mrs. Holton needed his help more than ever because her husband was suffering from the end stages of an aggressive form of cancer. He died not long after hiring Holmes. This part of the story involves 2 possible truths. 1. It was rumoured that after Dr. Holton died, Holmes bought the store from his widow. After the purchase was finalised, he murdered Mrs. Holton. He then told anyone who asked about her that she had moved to California for the warm air and sunshine. 2. Holmes bought the store from the widowed Mrs. Holton, and she stayed in the area until her natural death many years later. It is not clear which is true. In late 1886, Holmes married Merton Belknap. He was still very much married to his first estranged wife Clara, and filed a petition for divorce, but it was never finalised. The case was dismissed June 4, 1891. The couple had a daughter, Lucy Theodate Holmes, on July 4, 1891. His second bride and daughter lived primarily in Wilmot, Illinois, while Holmes worked in Chicago. He spent the majority of his time in Chicago tending to his business. In 1887, the ground was broken for the building that would become called the Castle. This would be Holmes' masterpiece, in his eyes. He bought the empty lot across the street from the Holton drugstore and designed a 3-story building that would operate as a retail space, apartments, offices, and hotel rooms. It earned its nickname the Castle because of its massive size. It took up almost an entire city block. Chicago had recently been chosen to host the upcoming World's Fair in 1893, which would attract visitors from all over the world. The World Fair was a cultural and social event to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America for the Europeans. It was scheduled to be opened May through October. This had been his inspiration. The construction of the castle was plagued with disputes. Holmes hired multiple companies for the construction, and after ultimately firing them, he would refuse to pay. He was sued by at least one company, Aetna Iron and Steel, in 1888. In truth, he hired and fired multiple construction crews because he didn't want one person or team of people to have a complete knowledge of his architectural vision. He had designed the castle with 51 doorways that opened to brick walls, 100 windowless rooms, stairs that led to nowhere, 2 furnaces in the basement, and a chute that would be used to drop bodies into the basement. Some of the rooms were soundproofed, some rooms were fitted with gas lines so he could pump in suffocating gas to asphyxiate his victims. There were trapdoors and peepholes. In his basement, he set up his laboratory. This was the area where he would drop the bodies, dissect them, strip them of flesh, and on some occasions, he would re-articulate the skeletons to sell to medical schools. To get rid of the rest of the body, he would dissolve pieces in large vats of acid or quicklime. Construction was completed in 1891, and Holmes immediately put out ads in the local newspaper offering jobs. He was primarily in the market for young women, housekeepers, bookkeepers, and the like. All employees of Holmes were required to have life insurance. He made an agreement with each employee. If they took out a policy and listed him as the beneficiary, he would pay the premiums. Most of them would disappear after being employed by Holmes for only a short time. The first victims connected to the castle was a mother, Julia Smythe Connor, and her young daughter Pearl. Julia and her husband Ned, along with their daughter, had moved into the building so that Ned could start working at the drugstore jewelry counter. An affair quickly flared up between Holmes and Mrs. Connor. When they were discovered, Ned fled, never to return to his wife or daughter again. The affair continued for a brief time until both mother and daughter went missing on Christmas Eve in 1891. Holmes told anyone who asked them that Julia had died during an abortion and he had sent Pearl to a children's home. It was never truly known what happened to them, but it was most likely devious. Other women who came to live and sometimes work in the building would disappear also. It was rumoured that Holmes would perform illegal abortions as well. When they died, he would dispose of their bodies in the basement lab. Emmeline Singrande disappeared in December 1892. Edna Van Tassel was not a confirmed victim of Holmes, but was strongly suspected of being one. He soon met Benjamin Pittersell, who was an ex-con exhibiting a coal bin that he recently invented. Pittersell would quickly graduate to Holmes' right-hand man. He was later described in a news article as being Holmes' tool, his creature. In early 1893, struggling actress Minnie Williams moved to Chicago. Holmes met her while she was waiting at the employment office. There are some accounts that say they actually met years before in Boston. Either way, their paths crossed once she was in Chicago, and he promptly offered her a job. While working as a stenographer, Holmes convinced Williams to sign over the deed to some property she owned in Fort Worth, Texas. He actually had it signed over under an alias, Alexander Bond. In the summer of 1893, Holmes and Williams went to Chicago's Lincoln Park posing as a husband and wife to rent an apartment. They claimed the apartment would be for Minnie's sister, Nanny. Once Nanny arrived in Chicago, she wrote a letter to her aunt expressing her excitement about an upcoming European grand tour. Neither Minnie nor Nanny were ever seen or heard from after July 5, 1893. Holmes came under some heat from Chicago's insurance companies for arson. They were looking to prosecute him, so he fled in July 1894. The next time his name, or any of his aliases, appeared was in Fort Worth, Texas. He owned the property that had once been Minnie's at the modern intersection of Commerce Street and 2nd Street. He had the vision to build another murder castle. While in Texas, he made a small fortune by stealing horses and having them shipped to St. Louis. He was arrested but bailed out quickly. Before he was bailed out, he made an acquaintance of his cellmate, Marlon Hedgepath, who was serving 25 years for an unknown crime. They concocted a plan to take an insurance company for $10,000. Holmes would take out the policy, fake his own death, then collect the insurance payout. He would give Hedgepath $500 in exchange for a lawyer's name who could assist him in case any issue arose. That attorney's name was Jephthah Howe. He was in practice with his brother Alfonso and was instantly intrigued by the scam. He wanted to participate and take a cut. The fraudulent scheme was put into action soon after his release from jail, but it failed when the insurance company became suspicious and refused to pay Holmes. Not to be deterred, Holmes went back to Philadelphia to try again. This time, his partner Pittersell would fake his death. Pittersell created a new persona for himself. He was now presenting himself as an inventor known as B.F. Perry. Their plan was to acquire a cadaver, disfigure it, burn it, and stage a scene to look like a lab explosion. Only, Holmes didn't find a cadaver. He murdered Pittersell instead. Holmes beat him, knocked him out with chloroform, and set his body on fire with benzene. He collected the insurance money for the actual death of Benjamin Pittersell. Holmes remained in contact with Pittersell's wife. She was unaware that her husband was dead. Holmes told her that he was hiding out in London, not wanting to be hanged in America for his crimes. She accepted this explanation for his absence. Holmes persuaded Mrs. Pittersell to let him accompany 3 of her 5 children on a tour of northern United States and Canada. She accompanied them but travelled on a parallel route with her oldest and youngest, while Holmes took Alice, Nellie and Howard. Holmes always seemed to be one step ahead of them. Along their travels, Holmes disposed of the girls Nellie and Alice by forcing them into a large trunk, locking them inside and pumping gas into the trunk via a small hose. The girls suffocated and died. He then took their naked bodies and buried them in a shallow grave in his Toronto rental house's cellar. The house where the girls was buried no longer exists. Neither does the address. The streets were realigned sometime later and renamed. Holmes disposed of Howard in an equally gruesome manner in a cottage in Indianapolis. He used drugs to knock the boy unconscious, chopped him up, and attempted to burn the body in the fireplace. When the body would not burn completely, he resorted to burying the remains in various places around the property. Since Holmes and Mrs. Pittersell were travelling parallel to each other and not directly together, she was unaware that 3 of her children were missing. When she eventually noticed their absence, he lied about their whereabouts. He managed to ditch Mrs. Pittersell in Detroit when he went to stay with his 3rd wife, Georgina Yoke. She was unaware that he was even married. She did not know where to find him. Later, when Detective Frank Geyer of the Pennsylvania Police was assigned to investigate Holmes and the missing children, the horrifying truth was uncovered. The bodies of the 2 girls were dug up in the Toronto cellar. Detective Geyer was quoted as saying, "The deeper we dug, the more horrible the odour became, and when we reached the depth of 3 feet, we discovered what appeared to be the bone of the forearm of a human being." Holmes' path was traced to the cottage in Indianapolis, where teeth and bone of Howard were found on the fireplace. Portions of the remainder of his body were uncovered around the property. The arrest of Holmes was made on November 17th, 1894 in Boston. He had been tracked down by the Pinkertons and arrested on an outstanding warrant from Texas. Once he was finally caught, the authorities reported that he was ready to flee the country. He had his bags packed and he was in the company of his 3rd wife. Word spread fast about Holmes's crimes, including the horrific murders of the Pittersell children. His castle was investigated by Chicago authorities and his house of horrors was exposed. There were decaying, festering bodies and body parts littering the basement. There were so many, and they were so decomposed that it was difficult to determine how many bodies there actually were. The other horrors of the hotel were also unearthed, and the castle became an infamous location, now known as the Murder Castle. H. Holmes is suspected of committing anywhere between 27 and 200 murders. The true number has never been confirmed. He was charged with the murder of Benjamin Pittersell and found guilty. For this, he was sentenced to hang. While in prison, he confessed to multiple murders, but some turned out to be false. Some of the people he reportedly murdered were still very much alive. He sold his confession and his story to the Hearst newspaper for $7,500, which, in today's money, would be approximately $226,000. It was a rambling confession and mostly nonsensical. He told contradictory stories about his life, his schemes, and his crimes. At one point, he claimed to be possessed by Satan. Holmes was such a prolific liar that it was difficult to separate fact from fiction. Holmes stated that after everything he had done, he was beginning to resemble the devil. He said that when he would stare at his reflection, he could see his features morphing into a satanical mask. "I was born with the devil inside of me," he said. On May 7, 1896, he was hanged at the Philadelphia County Prison for the murder of Howard Pittersell and Benjamin Pittersell. In the moments leading up to his death, he appeared to be calm and collected. He did have a special request for his burial. He asked to be buried 10 feet deep and covered in concrete to prevent grave robbers. He didn't want his body to be put on display or used in public dissections, an honour he did not grant many of his victims. When the trapdoor of the hanging platform dropped, he fell, but his neck did not break. He slowly strangled and was pronounced dead 20 minutes later. For the next century, it was rumoured that Holmes had escaped his death with a lookalike, continuing to scam and murder people. But in 2017, his body was disinterred by his great-great-great-grandson. It was proven that he was dead and buried in 1896 via DNA analysis. The murder castle was cleaned up and was set to open an attraction called the Holmes Horror Castle. Before it could open to the public, it was the subject of arson and burned to the ground. The area in Chicago where the castle once stood is now a post office. Thank you very much for listening. We'll be back next week with episode 6, The Boy Arrested for Arranging His Own Murder.